Almost 20 years ago, Scotland had one of the highest rates of violence in the developed world. Glasgow was synonymous with knife crime, and gang violence was a very real issue across the city. The situation had become so dire that a World Health Organization report found it to be the city with the highest homicide rate in Europe.
Glasgow was notorious for violence. To a certain degree, you grew up with it. It was celebrated. A lot of kids, myself included, didn't necessarily see a life beyond violence. It was normal to see somebody getting stabbed. It was normal to see somebody, a Friday night and gang violence happening.
The areas that I was and the experiences I had, I did come into contact with people. You go to a party and there's several different guys at the party and they're all carrying a knife because they don't know who they're going to come into contact with.
In 2005, the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit was established to address high levels of violent crime. In the following years, there was a steep decline in non-sexual violence, which dropped by almost half.
Glasgow was for 100 years thought of as no mean city, as a city of violence, of gangs, of alcoholism, of knife crime. And it's quite a remarkable success story that rather than thinking about Glasgow as the violent city now, it's the city that reduced violence.
Violence is definitely still here within Glasgow, there's absolutely no denying that. But there's more support for young people and children and families within the communities that we work in and across Glasgow, particularly in areas of deprivation. The police work has changed significantly and the way that they look at violence and really trying to work with communities rather than against them.
There's been a lot of changes over the last 15 years in regards to how we address violence. When we first started, it was seen primarily as a criminal justice problem, something for policing to solve. Now, it still recognises that policing is incredibly important, but what we recognise more and more in Scotland is the power of prevention and how we can actually stop the problem from becoming a crisis. Now, this has not been a single shift overnight, it's been an attitudinal change, not just amongst policing, but amongst most of our services.
This remarkable shift has left many asking, what worked? In 2011, the England riots brought the issue of disillusioned youth sharply into the public eye. In response, the government declared an all-out war on gangs and gang culture. This isn't some side issue, it's a major criminal disease that has infected streets and estates across our country. 6 years later, recorded knife crime began to increase, and violence once again came to dominate media headlines and political debate.
It's become a societal norm. Going to a funeral knowing someone's been stabbed or has a gun to me is a norm where I'm from. I think where young people have been concerned is the consistent stabbings that have been happening, the consistent violence and nothing being done.
I've met, many families who've been bereaved as a result of violence, and I think you can't even begin to see the incalculable kind of loss that they're feeling. I think there is something particularly traumatic for actually all Londoners to see that we're a society that somehow enables, a 13 or 14-year-old teenager to die.
Inspired by the Scottish experience, in 2018, the London Violence Reduction Unit was established by Mayor Sadiq Khan. Shortly after, the Home Office funded 17 regional violence reduction units, established a £200 million youth endowment fund and committed to police surge funding to tackle serious violence. However, there remains uncertainty about exactly what worked in Scotland and how lessons might travel to other areas of the UK.
One way of tackling this issue is through a public health approach. It's about the individual, it's about communities, and it's about societal issues itself.
For me, a public health approach really spells early intervention and prevention. It looks at an analysis of where there's an issue. It looks at how you support a broad group of people in a community setting. It then looks at building support for an individual that's been already affected or is really on the cusp of getting drawn into a life of violence that they don't want to do. So I think it's a very helpful framework.
Starting in 2021, a new research team will investigate what really lies behind Scotland's drop in serious violence and what lessons can be learned for other cities.
The positive outcomes of this study are really to understand not just what worked in terms of violence reduction, but where, when and under what circumstances. So lessons can be learned about what works with youth violence reduction for other places.
It will look back at the evidence and seek out perspectives both from those directly involved in policy and those affected by violence, to determine what works to prevent harm and drive change.
The story of violence reduction in Glasgow is ultimately a story of hope. If Glasgow, a city that had one of the highest rates of violent crime in Europe, can reduce violence by half, maybe it can happen elsewhere too, and maybe a little bit of that hope can spread to other cities.